Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really plunging in. We're looking at some fascinating, sometimes quite challenging philosophical source material.
We are. Specifically, it's supplements from Volume 3 of The World as Will and Idea. We're using the Haldane and Kemp translation, the 1909 sixth edition.
Right, digging into those supplements. And our goal, really, is to try and unpack these, well, pretty dense ideas about reality, consciousness, life, death.
Love, art, the whole shebang as presented in the specific philosophical system. Think of us as guides trying to pull out the key insights and, surprising connections.
Okay, so let's start right at the foundation, because everything seems to build on this core distinction they make.
Exactly. The world as will and the world as idea. That's the absolute starting point.
So the will, what exactly is it in this view?
The will is presented as the ultimate reality, the thing in itself, the inner essence of everything. But crucially, it's described as unconscious.
Unconscious, so it doesn't think or know.
No, not at all. It's just this blind, relentless striving, a fundamental driving force. They even see it, or an analogy to it, in inorganic nature, like chemical forces. Goethe's elective affinities is mentioned.
Okay, a blind force. And the idea then is how we see it.
Precisely. The idea is the world as it appears to us, the phenomenon, the world apprehended by our intellect.
And the intellect itself, how does that fit in?
Well, the intellect is tied directly to our physical organism, the brain, the nerves, the senses. It gets more developed as you go up the scale of animals.
And its job.
Primarily, its function is to serve the will. It provides knowledge of the world, which gives the will motives to act upon. It's fundamentally practical in this view.
You know, what's interesting is how this immediately pushes back against some other common ideas, like the soul.
Right. The sources really question that traditional concept of a simple, immaterial soul. They argue simplicity doesn't automatically mean it's not material or that it's immortal.
And it also takes aim at materialism, doesn't it? The idea that it's all just atoms and mechanics.
It does. They argue materialism just stops too short. It can describe how forces operate, maybe, but it ignores the original natural forces themselves, those old hidden qualities, and more fundamentally, it misses the underlying reality of the will altogether.
So it can't explain the source of the activity.
Exactly. It just describes the chain of events.
Okay, so we've got the will as the hidden driver and the idea as the world appearing to our intellect. Now, you mentioned the intellect. There's a strong Kantian echo here, right?
Oh, absolutely. Very much influenced by Kant. The idea that what we know are just phenomena, appearances, not the world as it truly is in itself.
And these appearances are shaped by our own minds.
Yes, by the fundamental structures of our intellect, particularly the forms of perception like space and time.
Which is a huge point, because it means space and time aren't features of the ultimate reality, the will.
They're features of how we perceive. They're like the framework our intellect imposes.
And that has big implications for, say, multiplicity, the fact that we see countless separate things.
It does. If space and time are just our forms of seeing, then the separation and multiplicity they create might not reflect the nature of the thing in itself, the will. That underlying reality might be fundamentally unified.
That's a bit mind-bending. And this perspective also shifts how they view teleology, the whole idea of design or purpose in nature.
Completely.
Yeah.
The argument is that the appearance of design, how organisms seem so perfectly suited for their purpose, that exists for our intellect.
Because we think in terms of ends and means.
Precisely. Our intellect imposes that framework. It's not necessarily that nature was consciously designed by an intellect or that purpose is inherent in the will itself.
So the apparent design is a product of our way of understanding, not a feature of the underlying reality.
That's the suggestion. If we could somehow grasp nature directly, the wonder of teleology would be seen as just the will objectifying itself, unfolding its nature, not following some external plan.
Okay, so this blind unconscious will is driving everything. Where do we see this most clearly in action, especially in living things? The sources talk a lot about instinct.
Yes, instinct is presented as a prime example. It's the will acting without knowledge. A motive acts, but the creature doesn't consciously understand why it's doing what it's doing or the ultimate goal.
So it's different from normal motivation, where you act because you consciously want something.
Exactly. Motivation comes from without, mediated by knowledge. Instinct comes from within, seemingly inexplicable, like a direct impulse of the will.
And the examples they give.
Oh, classic ones. The spider spinning its web perfectly the first time, a bird building its specific type of nest, the antlion's trap, even complex things like termite colonies, all done without learning or apparent understanding of the final product.
And they even point to a physical correlation.
Yeah, they note that creatures heavily guided by instinct, like insects, tend to have a more developed ganglion system, the sort of automatic subjective nervous system compared to the cerebral system, which is linked to objective conscious knowledge.
There was that really striking, almost disturbing example you mentioned from Kirby and Spence.
Ah, yes. The wasps observed stinging their own larvae to death when food runs out in autumn, or insect eggs that hatch precisely when their specific host plant buds, even if kept artificially.
Actions that make no sense for the individual's survival or knowledge.
Right. It suggests a force of the will acting for the species overriding the individual, an unconscious drive fulfilling a larger pattern.
Okay, this picture of a blind force driving us, often not for our individual good. It leads to a pretty bleak view of human life in these texts.
It's definitely pessimistic. Life is painted as full of suffering, care, want, a constant struggle for existence where destruction is always looming.
And this idea that pleasure isn't really a positive thing.
Yeah, that pleasure is negative, just the stopping of pain or desire. Pain, conversely, is seen as the positive, the undeniably real experience. They quote Petrarch, "1,000 pleasures are not worth one torment."
Wow. And then there's that really provocative claim that this is the worst of all possible worlds.
Yes, and it's not necessarily meant in a purely dramatic sense, but more that the world is just barely sustainable. It's constantly threatened by destruction, teetering on the edge, both on a cosmic scale and in our individual lives. It just about manages to exist.
And they connect suffering directly to guilt.
In a way, yes. The idea is that every significant suffering we experience somehow declares what we deserve simply by virtue of existing as part of this striving will. It couldn't happen to us, the argument goes, if we didn't, on some fundamental level, deserve it. That's a tough one.
Definitely a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
And all this striving naturally leads to egoism.
Deeply rooted egoism, yes. Because from its own standpoint, each individual is the entire will to live. It experiences itself as the center of everything.
Nature speaking from within each of us, saying, I alone am all in all.
Exactly. The rest may perish. That fundamental self-assertion is identified as the root of egoism.
Okay, so the will drives us, causes suffering, makes us egoistic. What about something like passionate love? That feels so incredibly personal. How does that fit?
Ugh. Love and procreation are seen as the absolute peak expression of the will to live objectifying itself. The act of generation is called the punctum saliens, the salient point, the concentration point of the will.
So passionate love isn't really about the two individuals finding happiness together.
Not primarily, according to this view. It's seen as the will of the species working through the individuals. It's a powerful drive to select a partner who will help produce the best possible next individual for the species' continuation and type.
So it's like an illusion, a trick.
Kind of, yeah. They call it an illusion or a powerful instinct that makes serving the species feel like an intensely personal, egoistic goal for the individual.
And they actually try to break down what drives attraction based on this?
They do. First, it's general signs of species health.
Yeah.
Youth, strength, beauty, vitality. But then, crucially, they talk about specific corrections. Individuals unconsciously seek partners who balance out their own deviations from the species norm.
Like little people might be drawn to big people to kind of average things out in the offspring.
Exactly, trying to produce an offspring closer to the ideal species type.
And this leads into that very specific theory about inheritance they propose.
Right. They suggest that the will, the character, the fundamental disposition tends to come from the father.
While the intellect comes from the mother.
Yes, intellect, cognitive abilities from the mother. Physical form from both, maybe size leaning towards the mother, but specific sex characteristics like male build or courage from the father.
And they actually use historical examples to try and back this up.
They do, quite extensively. They point to figures like Nero blaming his father for his bad character, his mother for his lack of intellect, then Hannibal and Hamilcar, the Scipios, Simon and Miltiades, Caesar Borgia, cases where they see the father's character passed down.
But then they also provide counterexamples for the intellect part.
Yes, arguing figures known for intellect or talent often had remarkable mothers, but less remarkable fathers. People like Pitt the Younger and Lord Chatham, Mozart, Buffon, the Carracci painters, Haydn, Cuvier. the Schlegels.
And Buffon himself apparently credited his mother.
Yes, they mentioned Buffon praising his mother's intellect, seeing it as evidence for this principle. It's a very detailed, if obviously speculative, attempt to link inheritance patterns to this will-intellect division.
That's really concrete. And this whole powerful drive for procreation, this species-level instinct, is then linked to parental love.
Directly. Parental love, especially maternal love, is seen as the mechanism ensuring the species continues after the individual is produced. The instinct is so strong, particularly in non-human animals, that it demonstrates, they argue, an implicit awareness that the true enduring reality is the species, not the individual.
Which explains those examples of mothers sacrificing themselves.
Exactly. Like the sea otter or the whale mother described as giving up their own lives to save their young. It's the species' will, the drive to perpetuate life, overriding the individual's will to live.
Okay, so we've established the intellect's main job is serving the will. But the sources also talk about what happens when the intellect gets freed up.
Yes, and this is where art and genius come in. Pure, objective understanding of the world, they argue, requires the intellect to detach itself, at least temporarily, from its service to the will, from constantly focusing on what's in it for me.
And this happens most profoundly in genius.
Right. Genius is defined as possessing the highest degree of this objective knowledge. It's characterized by having a free surplus of intellect cognitive power beyond what's strictly necessary for survival and serving the will's immediate needs.
And this is why they see a connection sometimes between genius and, well, seeming madness or eccentricity.
Exactly. Both states, genius and certain kinds of madness, are seen as involving a kind of separation of the intellect from the will's constant guidance.
So the genius might be brilliant objectively, but maybe clumsy or impractical in daily life.
Precisely. Their intellect isn't always tethered to guarding their personal interests, unlike the reasonable man, whose intellect is primarily a tool for navigating the world effectively. They use Goethe's Tasso and Antonio characters to illustrate this contrast.
And art plays a crucial role here. How does it help us achieve this objective state?
Art facilitates it by presenting the ideas in the Platonic sense, the eternal forms, the universal types of things, abstracted from the fleeting individual instances.
And this is why, say, a super-realistic wax figure isn't considered great art.
Right, because it presents the particular too completely. It leaves nothing for the imagination, which they see as essential for genius. Imagination allows the mind to grasp the universal idea suggested by the particular artwork.
And different arts capture different aspects.
Yes. Architecture objectifies fundamental forces like gravity and rigidity. Sculpture and painting capture the ideas of forms through sensation. Poetry uses imagination to convey ideas directly.
And music gets a special status.
A very special status. It's seen as bypassing the ideas altogether and being a direct copy or objectification of the will itself.
How so?
Its structure, tension, release, striving, satisfaction mirrors the fundamental nature of the will's endless cycle of desire and fulfillment, or lack thereof. It speaks a universal language of feeling. That's the context for that famous phrase, architecture is frozen music.
Interesting. And they also note that music and poetry seem more universally important across cultures than, say, painting or sculpture.
They do observe that, suggesting it points to their deeper connection either to the universal ideas, poetry, or the will itself, music.
Okay, moving from creativity towards the end. Death. How do the sources approach our fear of death?
Well, they argue that the intense fear, the fuga mortis, comes from the blind, will itself, the fundamental drive to exist. It doesn't come from the intellect.
Because the intellect is what actually perishes with the body.
Exactly. The knowing part ceases, so the fear stems from the non-knowing, purely striving part of us.
But there's still a concept of imperishableness.
Yes, but it's crucial to understand it's not about personal immortality. The individual phenomenon, you, me, as specific conscious beings tied to a body, perishes.
So what is imperishable?
The underlying reality, the will itself, or the Platonic idea that the individual was an instance of. That timeless essence is untouched by birth and death, which only affect the temporal appearance.
So it's the species that endures.
In a sense, yes. The species lives in what they call an endless present, constantly renewed through the cycle of birth and death. The analogy used is the species' individual dogs die, but the dogness, the idea, persists.
And ideas like reincarnation or rebirth.
They're interpreted as maybe an intuitive but often confused grasp of this deeper truth. People sense something endures, but mistakenly attribute it to the persistence of the individual personality, rather than the underlying will or idea. They point to Buddhism and Brahmanism as traditions that perhaps understood this more clearly, recognizing the need for deliverance from the cycle of existence itself.
And death itself gets a rather philosophical framing, a great reprimand.
Yes, a reprimand to the egoism inherent in the will to live. It's seen as a release from the one-sidedness of an individuality. The peaceful expression sometimes seen on the dead is interpreted as reflecting this liberation from the striving will.
Given this view of life as will-driven suffering, is there any way out, any path to salvation?
There is. The path offered is the denial of the will to live.
Denying the very thing that makes us exist. How is that possible?
It's tricky. The denial can't originate from the will itself, obviously. It requires the intellect gaining a kind of ascendancy, a loosening from its servitude to the will, allowing knowledge to turn against the will.
And this is reflected in things like asceticism.
Precisely. Practices like celibacy, voluntary poverty, fasting, renunciation of all worldly pleasures. These are seen as practical expressions of this denial. Mysticism is also linked to this turning away from the will. They even mention the Shakers as a contemporary example of a community embodying this principle.
But what does the state achieve through this denial? Can it be described?
According to the sources, no. It's fundamentally beyond our concepts and language, because all our tools for understanding belong to the world of phenomena, the world objectified by the will. So this ultimate state of release can only be spoken of negatively as what it is not. It remains a mere negation for us.
Wow. Okay. That has been a truly deep dive. We've traversed a huge amount of philosophical ground from the nature of reality itself, the will, the idea, through consciousness, instinct, love, art, death.
All viewed through this very specific, often challenging lens. That stark contrast between the blind, suffering will as the supposed core reality and the world as idea, the world we perceive, which holds both illusion and perhaps glimpses of truth in art.
And that deeply pessimistic take on suffering as inherent, yet with this difficult path towards release through renunciation.
Definitely a lot to take in. Which brings us to a final thought, drawing from the sources, for you to consider. If, as this philosophy suggests, our suffering is somehow tied to our very existence as manifestations of the will, if it implies a kind of guilt for just being.
What does that actually mean for how we should live our lives? Does it even call into question whether we ought to exist from this perspective?
Something profound to wrestle with.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this exploration into some very demanding but fascinating ideas.
We hope it's provided some clarity on the concepts within these texts. Maybe it sparks further reflection or even encourages you to look at the sources themselves.
Until our next deep dive, keep thinking, keep exploring,